Hi, Anne. Thank you for joining us. We're very lucky to be joined by Anne Singleton. Anne is at the University of Bristol School for Policy Studies. She's also the Migration Mobility's strategic lead on policy. She is the senior advisor to the, I've got to get the title right, she's the senior advisor to the International Organization for Migration's Global Migration Data Analysis Center in Berlin. And she's also the chair of trustees of State Watch. So very, very busy, and we're very lucky to have her. So thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
So Anne, as we can see from that kind of long list of titles that I've just rolled off, you do a lot of work that brings together policy and politics and research. So could you maybe just set the scene for us and tell us something about your work and how it brings these different domains together?
Yes, thank you. My work is at the interface really between research and policy. And I work closely with civil society organisations to try and help with the dynamics of the understanding the production of knowledge on migration, the way in which what we know about migration is informed by official data, the official evidence base, but also the way that civil society plays a role in informing us, and the media coverage on migration informs us. But I also work very closely with many academics to try and make sure that academic research is not determined by current policy priorities, but instead can interrogate the gaps in the policy and interrogate what is hidden within and behind the official data. So where our understanding of migration is informed by the reproduction of official categories of knowledge and official concepts and definitions used to define and to other people, that we as social scientists, that we should have a responsibility to use our academic and disciplinary strengths to make sure that we can also help to set an agenda for policy. So it's an interaction between different actors in the reproduction of this knowledge, and it's a very fertile ground for improving our understanding of the whole of society, really.
That's great, and really fits very well with the course. So in the previous sessions, students have really been kind of interrogating the sorts of categories that are used and that define the knowledge that is produced. But one category that we haven't really interrogated is the category of policymaker. So can you tell us what you understand by a policymaker?
Again, it's like the term migrant. It's used to mean different things to different people, and everyone's using the same term, but not necessarily explaining or being transparent about who they refer to. So policy making is a process that happens at local, national and international levels. There are many different people involved in this process of policy making, and they may have different levels of seniority within institutions, within government ministries, within the UN agencies. And the title policymaker doesn't really help us to understand how power works in those institutions, and how a senior policymaker might actually have a very different role to someone who's fairly low down in the hierarchy of an institution. So policymakers is a phrase used by academics and by people who define themselves as policymakers, but it's very often not made clear what this means. It's a catch-all category.
So we need to interrogate it in terms of the context within which it's being used.
Yes.
So lots of people who research migration are really keen to engage with policymakers, and just broadly understood. Could you tell us what you think the risks and the gains are of that kind of engagement?
Well, I think there's a risk, always a risk in where the funding priorities lie in funding academic research, and where the money comes from kind of determining the framework for our understanding of migration. So there is a risk in, and there's an opportunity obviously in being able to obtain government funding, in having access to policymakers. There's an opportunity. There's also a risk that your research agenda and your research questions could be predetermined by the current policy priorities of the funding body or of the people who you're engaging with. There are, in many fields of policy, there are what is known as basically tame academics who perform the role really of legitimizing what is happening in the policy world and the priorities of government. We see that in all fields of policy. In migration, there is a danger, I think, particularly at in the discussions we've had around the research policy nexus, that there's a circulation of ideas between the researchers and the policymakers, which doesn't allow the oxygen of transparency, doesn't include the voices of people who are the recipients of the policy. So migrants, of NGOs, of civil society, people who may not be defined as migrants, but whose civil liberties are being affected by the policies that are implemented. So I think there's a responsibility for researchers to always be reflexive and self-reflexive about, we should all be thinking about our role in this engagement with policy. So the biggest risk is to believe that that you become more important and your work is more important because it's being used by policymakers, when in fact it may actually be helping to support a system which is reproducing inequalities.
So can you give us an example of a good, a positive engagement between academic research and policy?
Well, if I could use my own example, I think what I've always tried to do is to make public and transparent the data that are produced by official bodies, particularly in the field of migration and asylum. So I see my own positive contribution in engaging with policy was to see a gap in the knowledge base for policy, and to say that the data are inadequate, they are not properly produced under any legislative arrangements. And I worked in a very determined way to produce, in the end, legislation for the European Union, which became law across 28 countries and requires official bodies to collect migration and asylum statistics in a systematic way with, as far as possible, common methodologies, and to properly validate the data and to publish them so that they're accessible free of charge from Eurostat to all users. So the members of the public, researchers, journalists can have the same access to data as the policymakers. And that's not an end in itself. The idea of that was that it would make available information and resources for to inform public debate and to encourage a healthy democratic debate about what should be happening with migration policies. So I think that's one way to engage, is to be fairly single-minded about what you want to do, and to, as a researcher, to define how you will interact in the policy world without necessarily compromising the final objective of what you want to achieve, but actually being able to work with some empathy with people within the institutions who are generally very professional and want to work to the highest standards. So it's a matter of always being conscious and aware of your role, but also being honest about that. I was always straightforward. This is what I wanted to achieve, with some transparency in the data. And if you speak with confidence about what you want to achieve, people will respect that. So some of the lessons I've learned from doing that with the European Commission helped me then to go on to help and advise the International Organization for Migration on their data collection. And the very controversial issues involved around working with agencies around human rights issues, that my concern was to make sure that the the data would be transparent and available. And I think what we've done, what the director of IOM's GMDAC has done, Frank Lasco, is to make available through the UN machinery some of the most up-to-date and best quality data available across the world, and that everyone has access to that through the migration data portal. So you can go there as a one-stop shop, really, to find all the data that policymakers use across the globe. So I think it's possible to work effectively and positively with policymakers if you're very clear about what you're doing and why you're doing it, and if it's something that is going to achieve a positive outcome for all concerned.
So Anne, we've talked a bit about your engagement with policymakers. Can you tell us something about working with activists, and more particularly this kind of how you would respond to this criticism that if you are working with activists, then you're not being an objective researcher?
Okay, so I think one very important point here is that I would start from the position that there's no such thing as objective knowledge, and we're all actors in different ways in the social and political world. And that's why we need a reflexive approach that understands our activities and how they have impacts on other people. So working with civil society groups is no contradiction. In fact, much of the information and knowledge that we have comes from qualitative research that is done directly with people who are working on the front line, really, in some of the most difficult situations. And so adding that richness and texture to our understanding of what happens in migration is very important to work with civil society and to be part of that activity. It doesn't mean to say that you can't be critical. It doesn't mean to say that that you have to be critical either as well. So there's a way in which we can be engaged activist scholars that actually understands the importance of that real human experience of migration, and that can also inform the priorities of policymakers. So my work on data sounds very dry, but what I've tried to always promote is the idea that what is not visible in the data is really the most important, very often the most important realities in migration. And to find out what those realities are, researchers need to work closely with the people who are engaged in the real world working with migration issues.
I wonder if, taking off from that, you could just end by telling us something about the Memorialisation project.
Well, this is perhaps one important contribution that we can make as researchers and as activists, is to say what we're trying to do in the Memorialisation project is to bring together the people who are survivors and the people and the families of people who died and gone missing during migration, not in a physical sense, but in a community of interest with people across the globe who've experienced such loss, and to memorialise in a way that respects the dignity of all involved, rather than defining people just as migrants, but to say that human beings have died or gone missing, and that we need to have a form of global recognition of what's happening with humanity throughout the history of humanity. People have died during migration or during journeys, and this is nothing new, but we need to make sure that there's some international system for accrediting sites. So we're hoping to prepare a proposal to go to UNESCO to have an internationally accredited system for recognising sites of death, for memorialising people's journeys and the losses that families have experienced. So it's a project that works with, we're working with activist scholars, with NGOs, with families and survivors, and with policymakers in Europe, in the United States, in West Africa, and in South Africa at the moment. So that's a collaboration really, which has interest has been expressed from all different areas of our activities. So the idea is to make a positive contribution for the whole of humanity through our academic work and with the NGOs and with the survivors.
Thanks very much, Anne, and thanks very much for your really important work.